Money can buy expensive clothes, massive mansions, and powerful friends, but it can never buy a clear conscience. Sometimes the people who act the most superior are hiding the darkest, most unforgivable secrets. This is a story about a cruel woman who thought she held all the cards. She wanted to crush a young girl's dreams simply for being poor. But she made one fatal mistake. She invited the girl's father into her home. Get ready for a cinematic journey of deceit, stolen fortunes, and a twist you will never see coming. Chloe was a young woman with a heart full of compassion. She worked long hours at a local animal rescue in upstate New York. She grew up on a modest dairy farm. Her parents, Tom and Martha, taught her the value of hard work and honesty. Julian came from a completely different universe. His family, the Sterlings, lived in a sprawling estate in Connecticut. They owned a massive chain of gas stations across the East Coast. Julian's mother, Victoria, was a notorious socialite. She was ruthless in business and cruel to her staff. Her husband, Richard, was a silent shadow who spent his days drinking expensive bourbon. Despite his toxic family, Julian was kind, humble, and deeply in love with Chloe. But Victoria was determined to destroy their relationship at any cost. The midday sun beat down relentlessly on the manicured lawns of the Sterling estate. The air was thick with the scent of blooming hydrangeas and freshly cut grass. Chloe stood on the grand limestone porch. Her hands nervously smoothed the fabric of her simple yellow sundress. Next to her stood Julian. His supportive hand rested gently on her waist. He gave her a reassuring squeeze. The heavy mahogany door slowly creaked open. Victoria Sterling stepped out into the harsh daylight. She wore a silk emerald blouse that screamed of aggressive wealth. Her perfectly styled blonde hair remained rigid against the slight summer breeze. She slowly looked Chloe up and down. A sharp smirk curled the corners of her dark red lips. Her pale eyes held nothing but pure, unadulterated disdain. The silence stretched for a painfully long moment. The only sound was the distant splashing of the backyard fountain. Finally, Victoria spoke. Her voice was like ice clinking in a crystal glass. She complimented Chloe's dress in a tone completely dripping with poison. She casually asked if the fabric was salvaged from a local thrift store bin. The insult hung heavy in the warm summer air. Chloe felt an instant rush of heat to her cheeks. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. Every visit to this mansion felt like stepping into a snake pit. She swallowed hard, trying to maintain her dignity. The air around them smelled of expensive rose perfume and bitter hostility. Julian felt the tension radiating from Chloe. His jaw tightened in anger. He stepped slightly in front of her, shielding her from his mother's piercing gaze. He told Victoria to stop with her ridiculous, biting remarks. His voice was firm and unwavering. He reminded his mother that Chloe was the woman he loved. He declared that they were going to be married very soon. He demanded that Victoria treat his future wife with the basic respect she deserved. The confrontation caused a brief flicker of surprise in Victoria's eyes, but she quickly masked it with a sickeningly sweet smile. She clasped her hands together in mock innocence. She claimed she was only joking with the poor girl. Then she dropped her real bombshell. She announced that she wanted to host a formal dinner this weekend. She insisted it was time to finally meet Chloe's parents. She said the wedding was approaching, and it was simply unacceptable that the families had not formally dined together. She mentioned discussing budgets and catering menus. Her tone implied that Chloe's family could never afford a single appetizer. She instructed Chloe to pass along the invitation for Saturday evening. Without waiting for an answer, Victoria turned on her designer heels. She walked back into the dark, air-conditioned mansion. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind her. The sharp sound echoed across the empty porch. Chloe let out a shaky breath she did not realize she had been holding. They walked quickly down the long, winding driveway. The gravel crunched loudly beneath their shoes. Chloe felt a knot of pure panic forming in her stomach. She looked up at Julian, her eyes wide with fear. She told him that his mother was absolutely terrifying. She admitted her deep fear of exposing her kind, simple parents to Victoria's venom. Her parents were honest farmers. They did not understand the cruel psychological games played by the wealthy elite. She feared her mother would be crushed by the inevitable insults. Julian stopped walking. He pulled Chloe into a tight, comforting embrace. He kissed the top of her head. He inhaled the sweet scent of her apple shampoo. He begged her not to worry. He promised that they would move far away after the wedding. He admitted his mother was a difficult, controlling woman. He explained she was used to dominating corporate boardrooms and terrifying her employees. He revealed that Victoria had already picked out a bride for him. It was a daughter of a wealthy real estate developer. But Julian had refused. He told Chloe that she was the only woman he would ever love. He swore he would protect her and her family during this dreaded dinner. The afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line. The shadows grew longer on the sprawling lawn. They stood together by the massive iron gates. Chloe rested her head on his chest. She'd listened to the steady, calming rhythm of his heartbeat. Later that night, Chloe lay awake in her small apartment. The moonlight filtered through the cheap blinds, casting stripes across the worn carpet. Sleep refused to come. Her mind was a chaotic storm of anxiety. She kept replaying Victoria's cruel words. The upcoming dinner felt like an impending disaster. To calm her racing heart, she forced herself to think about the past. She remembered the chaotic, terrifying day she first met Julian. It was a memory etched permanently into her soul. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The sky was the colour of bruised iron. She had been driving back from the animal clinic. Suddenly, she saw a tiny, trembling shape on the side of the busy interstate. It was a small, scruffy terrier mix. The puppy was terrified, darting back and forth near the roaring traffic. Cars were flying by at dangerous speeds. The spray from the wet asphalt created a blinding mist. The puppy took a step onto the actual highway. A massive delivery truck was hurtling directly toward the helpless animal. The truck's horn blared, a deafening, terrifying sound. Chloe did not even think. Pure adrenaline flooded her veins. She slammed on her brakes. She threw her car door open and sprinted into the pouring rain. Her shoes slipped on the wet pavement. She ignored the danger. All she saw was the innocent life about to be extinguished. She waved her arms frantically, screaming at the top of her lungs. The massive tires of the truck screeched against the wet asphalt. The smell of burning rubber filled the damp air. Chloe lunged forward. She grabbed the soaked, shivering puppy just inches away from the massive bumper. She curled her body around the small animal, preparing for an impact. Suddenly, a strong hand gripped her arm. Someone pulled her backward with incredible force. She stumbled away from the rushing traffic. The truck roared past them, splashing dirty water over her jeans. The angry driver yelled obscenities out the window. He tapped his forehead, calling her a lunatic. Chloe collapsed onto the grassy shoulder of the highway. Her chest heaved violently. She looked up through the rain. Standing over her was a tall, athletic young man. He was wearing a ruined designer coat. Raindrops dripped from his dark hair. This was Julian. He knelt beside her on the muddy grass. He asked if she was hurt. His voice was remarkably calm despite the chaos. Chloe could barely speak. She was trembling from the cold and the massive adrenaline crash. She clutched the whining puppy to her chest. She stammered out a rapid apology and a desperate thank you. She explained she worked at a nearby rescue shelter. She said the puppy had a broken leg and needed immediate medical attention. Julian did not hesitate. He offered to drive them both in his car. It was a moment of pure, unexpected kindness. Julian followed her into the chaotic environment of the animal shelter. The building smelled intensely of bleach, wet fur, and medicine. A chorus of loud barks and meows greeted them. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Chloe handed the injured terrier to the clinic's veterinarian. She thanked Julian again. She expected him to turn around and leave. His expensive clothes were ruined with mud and dog hair. But he stayed. He seemed fascinated by her world. He asked for a tour of the facility. Chloe walked him down the long aisle of metal cages. She showed him a black cat with a missing eye. She explained the cat had been thrown from a moving vehicle. She introduced him to an elderly golden retriever, abandoned in the woods. The old dog pressed his grey muzzle against the chain-link fence. Chloe's voice cracked with emotion as she told their tragic stories. She spoke with immense passion. She believed every broken soul deserved a second chance at love. Julian watched her intensely. He was completely captivated. He had grown up surrounded by incredibly wealthy, superficial people. He had never met someone so genuinely selfless. He reached through the cage and gently scratched the old retriever behind the ears. He looked at Chloe and smiled. It was a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Right then and there, Julian made a surprising offer. He said he lived in a massive house with huge grounds. He offered to adopt the injured terrier they had just saved. Chloe was completely stunned. She warned him that adopting a traumatized dog was a massive responsibility. She told him it wasn't a game. The puppy would need physical therapy and endless patience. Julian nodded seriously. He looked her right in the eyes. He promised he would be an excellent owner. He then smoothly suggested that Chloe could visit the puppy regularly to check on his progress. He asked her out on a date. He wanted to take her for coffee and a movie. Chloe felt a sudden flutter in her chest. She looked at his messy hair and his ruined, expensive coat. He was incredibly handsome, but more importantly, he was kind. She smiled shyly and agreed. That very first date was a disaster in the best possible way. They talked for hours in a small, dimly lit coffee shop. The smell of roasted beans and vanilla filled the air. They completely missed their movie. They ended up walking through the city streets until 3 a.m. They stood on a bridge overlooking the dark river, watching the city lights reflect on the water. They talked about their dreams, their fears, and their vastly different childhoods. Chloe felt a deep, immediate connection. It was as if they had known each other in a past life. Julian called her his brave little saviour. The cool night breeze blew her long brown hair across her face. He gently tucked a strand behind her ear. That night, under the glow of street lamps, their beautiful romance officially began. As their relationship deepened, Chloe learned the truth about Julian's family. The Sterlings were incredibly rich, but their wealth had a very dark reputation in the local community. People whispered behind closed doors. They said the family had come into their massive fortune very suddenly in the late 90s. Before that, they had been practically invisible. Nobody knew exactly how they built their empire of gas stations. The rumours suggested illegal activities, blackmail, or worse. The truth was buried deep. Victoria ran the business with an iron fist. She was known to scream at contractors and fire employees for the smallest mistakes. She squeezed every penny out of her suppliers. She treated waitstaff and service workers like absolute garbage. Richard, Julian's father, was entirely useless. He was a weak, pathetic man who spent his days at the country club. He blindly followed Victoria's orders. He liked to brag about his sports cars and expensive watches. He lived in a constant haze of aged scotch and cigars. Julian was the complete opposite of his terrible parents. He dressed simply in jeans and plain shirts. He drove a modest car. He treated everyone with respect. He was currently finishing his degree in economics. He wanted to start a charity foundation. Chloe loved him for his pure heart. She ignored the dark shadow of his family. She believed love could conquer anything, but the upcoming dinner was a terrifying reality check. The memory of her first meeting with Victoria still haunted Chloe. Julian had brought her to the mansion a few months ago for a brief introduction. Chloe had worn a tasteful navy blue dress. She had styled her hair perfectly. She wanted so desperately to make a good impression. But the moment she walked into the grand foyer, she felt completely suffocated. The house looked like a sterile museum. Huge classical paintings covered the walls. Massive bronze statues sat in the corners. Everything looked untouchable and cold. Victoria had greeted her with a chilling, fake smile. Richard sat in the leather armchair, swirling an amber liquid in a crystal glass. He stared at Chloe with small, calculating eyes. They sat at a massive mahogany dining table. Victoria immediately started the interrogation. When Chloe proudly mentioned her family's small dairy farm, Victoria's face twisted in disgust. She made a cruel joke about the smell of manure. When Chloe talked about her work at the animal shelter, Victoria laughed out loud. She called the rescue dogs filthy, flea-ridden mutts. She implied that Chloe was only dating Julian to secure a luxurious future. Chloe had tried to stay polite. She tried to defend her passions. But Victoria was relentless. The barrage of subtle insults and degrading comments finally broke her. Tears had welled up in her eyes. The fancy dinner tasted like ash in her mouth. She had excused herself and ran out of the massive front doors. Julian had chased after her that night. He had yelled at his mother, calling her behaviour disgusting and unforgivable. He found Chloe crying near the fountain in the driveway. He held her tightly under the pale moonlight. He apologised profusely for his mother's cruelty. He wiped the tears from her cheeks. He promised her that his parents' opinions meant nothing to him. He vowed that they would build their own life, completely separate from the Sterling Empire. That night, sitting on the edge of the fountain, Julian asked Chloe to marry him. He didn't have a ring yet. It was a spontaneous, desperate declaration of true love. Chloe had said yes through her tears. They decided to keep the engagement a secret for a while. They rented a small, cosy apartment near the university. They painted the walls bright colours. They bought cheap, comfortable furniture. They created a safe haven away from the toxic judgment of his family. But secrets never last forever. Victoria eventually found out about the impending wedding. She was absolutely furious. She threatened to cut Julian off completely. She threatened to write him out of the will, but Julian did not care. He was perfectly happy eating cheap takeout pizza with Chloe on their tiny sofa. He felt free for the first time in his life. But Victoria was not a woman who accepted defeat. She changed her tactics. She pretended to accept the wedding. She set the trap. She insisted on meeting the humble farm parents. The day of the dreaded dinner arrived. The sky was overcast, matching Chloe's terrible mood. She was completely frantic. She paced back and forth in her small kitchen. She called her parents to warn them. She begged her father, Tom, to just cancel. She cried into the phone saying Victoria was going to humiliate them. She told him that Victoria was an evil, venomous snake. She said she couldn't bear to see her sweet mother insulted. Tom's voice on the other end of the line was surprisingly calm. It was not his usual booming, jovial tone. His voice was deep, steady, and incredibly serious. He told Chloe to breathe. He told her not to worry about a single thing. He said he had handled much worse people in his long life. He instructed her to go to the mansion with Julian and wait for them. He promised that tonight everything was going to change forever. He said it with such absolute certainty that it sent a bizarre shiver down Chloe's spine. She hung up the phone, feeling deeply confused. Her father was just a simple farmer. How could he possibly handle a shark like Victoria Sterling? Julian walked into the kitchen wearing a dark suit. He kissed her cheek and told her it was time to go. They drove to the mansion in absolute silence. The tension in the car was suffocating. The heavy iron gates of the estate slowly swung open. They drove up the long, winding path. The mansion looked like a dark fortress against the grey sky. Victoria and Richard were waiting in the grand living room. Victoria was dressed like she was attending a royal gala. She wore an absurdly expensive gown covered in thousands of tiny Swarovski crystals. A ridiculous diamond necklace choked her throat. She looked like a walking chandelier. Richard was already holding a glass of scotch. He wore a velvet smoking jacket. They looked utterly absurd for a simple family dinner. It was a calculated display of massive wealth, meant to intimidate the poor farmers. Victoria smiled at Chloe. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth. She loudly complained about the delay. She wondered if the country bumpkins got lost, trying to find a real neighbourhood. She joked that they probably broke down in an old pickup truck on the highway. Julian clenched his fists, ready to explode. Just then, the heavy brass doorbell echoed through the massive house. The sound was incredibly loud. A uniformed maid rushed to open the grand double doors. Chloe held her breath. She expected to see her father in his usual flannel shirt and worn jeans. She expected her mother to be holding a basket of homemade jam. The heavy doors swung open. The cool evening breeze swept into the foyer. Two figures stepped into the bright light of the crystal chandelier. Chloe gasped out loud. Her jaw practically hit the floor. Julian stared in utter disbelief. Even Victoria stopped breathing for a second. Standing in the doorway was a distinguished gentleman, and an incredibly elegant lady. It was Tom and Martha, but they looked completely unrecognizable. Tom was wearing a perfectly tailored, dark, grey Armani suit. The fabric practically shimmered under the lights. He wore a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. Gold cufflinks gleamed at his wrists. His grey hair was neatly styled. He looked like an incredibly powerful Wall Street executive. Martha stood beside him. She wore a stunning, floor-length midnight blue gown. The dress draped elegantly over her figure. A breathtaking sapphire pendant rested against her collarbone. Her hair was swept up in a sophisticated French twist. She looked like old money royalty. They did not look like simple farmers. They looked like they owned the entire state. Victoria's smug smile completely vanished. Her face went entirely blank with pure shock. She blinked rapidly, trying to process the impossible sight in front of her. For a long moment, the only sound in the massive foyer was the ticking of a grand grandfather clock. Tom stepped fully into the room. His posture was commanding. He did not look intimidated. He looked around the extravagant room with an expression of cold, clinical disgust. He locked eyes with Victoria. His gaze was incredibly sharp and dangerous. Martha smiled politely, but her eyes were equally cold. They walked past the stunned maid and stepped right into the centre of the living room. Victoria finally found her voice. It was slightly higher pitched than usual. She tried to regain her dominant position. She laughed nervously. She sarcastically asked if they had sold their entire herd of cattle just to rent those fancy clothes. She asked which bank gave them a loan to buy such expensive accessories. She tried to mock them, but her voice lacked its usual venom. She was clearly rattled. She joked that they must be trying to trick her into paying for the entire wedding. Tom did not laugh. He did not even crack a smile. He stood entirely still. He stared directly into Victoria's eyes. The silence in the room became incredibly heavy. It felt like the air pressure had suddenly dropped before a massive thunderstorm. Tom slowly shook his head. His voice was deep, loud, and commanded absolute authority. He told Victoria to shut her mouth. The words echoed off the high ceiling. Victoria gasped, stepping back. No one had ever spoken to her like that in her own home. Richard nearly dropped his glass of scotch. Tom pointed a firm finger at the massive front door. He told Victoria and Richard to pack their things and get out immediately. He stated very clearly that this house did not belong to them. He said he knew exactly who they really were. He knew about the dark, filthy secrets of their past. Chloe felt her knees go weak. What was her father talking about? The atmosphere in the room turned absolutely freezing. Victoria's face turned paper white. All the fake tan in the world couldn't hide the sudden terror in her eyes. Richard set his glass down on a side table. His hands were shaking visibly. They looked at each other with pure, undisguised panic. Victoria tried to stutter out a defence. She asked what this crazy old man was talking about. She threatened to call the police and have him arrested for trespassing, but she didn't move toward the phone. She stayed frozen in place. Tom stepped further into the living room. He began pacing slowly, looking at the expensive items around them. He pointed at a massive, classical oil painting above the fireplace. He stated exactly what year it was painted and the name of the obscure European artist. He pointed at a pair of antique bronze candlesticks on the mantel. He knew their exact historical origin. He turned back to the trembling couple. He announced that he knew the true owner of this incredible estate. He spoke a name that made Victoria flinch as if she had been physically struck. Arthur Vance. Tom explained that Arthur Vance was a brilliant, reclusive millionaire. He was a man who tragically died in a horrific car accident many years ago, along with his young wife. Tom's voice dropped. He revealed that Arthur Vance had been his best friend and business partner. They had built a massive fortune together during the turbulent, chaotic early 90s. Chloe was incredibly confused. Her father, a millionaire's business partner? Tom continued his explosive revelation. The room was deathly quiet. Even Julian was paralyzed listening to this impossible story. Tom explained that he had made a terrible mistake in his youth. He had trusted the wrong people in a shady business deal. He ended up taking the fall for a massive financial crime. He was sent to federal prison for a decade. While he was locked behind bars, his best friend Arthur died in that terrible crash. Tom said his heart was completely broken. But the tragedy did not end there. Arthur did not trust traditional banks. He was deeply paranoid. He kept his massive fortune, rare art, gold bars, and millions in cash hidden in a massive underground vault right here in this very house. Only a few people knew about the vault. When Tom finally got out of prison, he discovered that the vault was entirely empty. The fortune had vanished. He spent years searching for the truth. He looked directly at Victoria and Richard. His eyes blazed with fury. He told them the truth was finally standing right in front of him. He asked a simple, devastating question. How did a simple cook and a lazy groundskeeper suddenly become multi-millionaire oil tycoons? The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Victoria gasped. Richard covered his face with his trembling hands. Tom had exposed them. The great, terrifying Sterling family were nothing but opportunistic, thieving domestic servants. Tom's voice was relentless. He described how Victoria and Richard had worked for Arthur Vance. They lived in the tiny staff quarters behind the garage. They served him meals and cut his grass. When the terrible news of the car crash reached the house, they didn't mourn. They saw an opportunity. They had secretly watched Arthur open the vault. They knew the combination. Like greedy, starving rats, they emptied the safe. They stole the cash, the bearer bonds, the antique jewellery, and the rare art. They stole the seed money they used to build their massive gas station empire. They disappeared into the night. They changed their last name to Sterling. They reinvented themselves as wealthy socialites. Tom pointed at Richard's wrist. He demanded that Richard take off his extremely expensive custom gold watch. Richard shook his head, terrified. Tom stepped forward, his physical presence completely overwhelming the weak man. Richard fumbled with the clasp. He handed the heavy gold watch to Tom. Tom turned it over and showed it to Julian and Chloe. The back of the watch was severely scratched, but a faint engraving was still visible. It read, "To Arthur, for a lifetime of brotherhood, from Tom." Tom explained he gave that very watch to Arthur 30 years ago. Richard had tried to scratch off the names, but he was too stupid to do it properly. The physical proof was undeniable. The entire Sterling empire was built on stolen blood money. Victoria suddenly snapped. The shock wore off, replaced by feral desperation. She screamed that Tom was completely insane. She shrieked that he had absolutely no solid proof. A scratched watch and a wild story from an ex-convict would never hold up in a court of law. She laughed hysterically, her diamond necklace shaking. She claimed they were legitimate business owners. She said the police would lock Tom back in a tiny prison cell. But Tom just smiled. It was a cold, victorious smile. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound diary. The leather was old, cracked, and faded. He held it up in the air. He explained that Arthur's elderly mother, Margaret, had been living in this house when the crash happened. She was frail and suffering from early dementia. Victoria had tricked the poor old woman. She manipulated her into signing a massive stack of legal documents. She convinced Margaret she was signing papers for a small beach cottage. In reality, Margaret signed over the deed to the entire estate. Victoria literally threw her employer's grieving mother onto the streets. The poor woman ended up in a low-income state nursing home. But Margaret wasn't entirely lost. In her moments of clarity, she wrote everything down. She documented the theft, the manipulation, and the cruel words Victoria used. She wrote it all in this diary. She gave it to a trusted nurse before she died. Tom had found the nurse. Tom stared at Victoria. She was now gasping for air like a fish out of water. The diary was the final nail in her coffin. But Tom wasn't finished. He turned to look at Julian. His eyes softened slightly. He took a deep breath. He revealed the most shocking secret of all. He told Julian that he was not Victoria and Richard's biological son. He was adopted. Victoria couldn't have children. But high society demanded a complete family picture. A wealthy couple needed an heir to look legitimate. So, they bought a baby through a shady, private agency. They adopted Julian just to use him as a perfect little prop for their massive lie. Julian stumbled backward. He hit the edge of the mahogany table. The colour drained completely from his handsome face. He looked at the woman who had terrorised him his whole life. He looked at the man who had ignored him. He whispered, asking if it was true. Victoria looked away. She couldn't meet his eyes. Her silence was a deafening confirmation. Julian felt a massive wave of dizziness. But underneath the shock, a strange, beautiful feeling began to bloom. It was relief. He was not a Sterling. He did not share their toxic, venomous blood. He was free. He looked over at Chloe. She was crying silently, her hands covering her mouth. But the evening's revelations were still not over. Tom turned his attention directly to his trembling daughter. The biggest secret was yet to come. Tom walked slowly toward Chloe. He took her small, trembling hands in his large, warm ones. Tears welled up in his tough, weathered eyes. He spoke to her with immense, overwhelming love. He told her the story of Arthur's car crash again. Arthur and his wife died instantly on that rainy highway, but there was a third passenger in the car, a tiny 2-year-old baby girl. By an absolute miracle, the baby survived the crushing impact. The authorities placed the orphan in a state system because her elderly grandmother couldn't care for her. When Tom was finally released from federal prison, his first mission was to find his best friend's child. Because of his criminal record, the state refused to let him adopt her. So he had his sister, Martha, officially adopt the little girl. They raised her together on the quiet, peaceful farm. They hid her away from the dangerous, greedy people of her past. They loved her as their own flesh and blood. Tom looked deep into Chloe's tear-filled eyes. He told her that he wasn't her biological father. He told her she was the sole surviving heir of Arthur Vance. This massive mansion, the stolen millions, the art, everything, it all rightfully belonged to her. Chloe's knees finally gave out. Julian rushed forward and caught her before she hit the marble floor. She was the billionaire heiress. The cruel woman who had mocked her for being poor was actually living in Chloe's stolen house. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Victoria dropped to her knees, screaming in denial. She clawed at the expensive rug, crying about her ruined reputation. Richard ran to the liquor cabinet and grabbed a full bottle of bourbon. He didn't bother with a glass. He drank straight from the bottle, his hands shaking violently. He knew it was over. The police would be called. The IRS would investigate the origins of their money. The fraud was too massive to hide. Tom pulled out his cell phone. He told them they had exactly 1 hour to pack whatever fit in the trunks of their cars and leave the property. If they were still here when the timer went off, he would hand the diary, the watch, and the DNA evidence straight to the FBI. Victoria looked up, her face a mask of smeared expensive makeup and pure hatred. She spat venom at Julian. She told him he was a worthless orphan they had saved from the gutter. She yelled that he was no longer her son. She fired him from the company and told him he wouldn't get a single dime. Julian stood tall. He held Chloe tightly against his chest. He looked down at the pathetic woman on the floor. His voice was incredibly calm and steady. He told Victoria that losing her was the greatest gift he had ever received. He told her to enjoy her new life in a prison cell. He turned his back on her completely. It was the ultimate crushing defeat. The next hour was a blur of frantic, pathetic activity. Victoria and Richard scrambled up the grand staircase. They stuffed designer clothes and whatever loose jewellery they could find into leather suitcases. They argued bitterly with each other, screaming accusations down the hallway. Tom, Martha, Julian and Chloe waited outside on the grand limestone porch. The night air was cool and refreshing. The heavy, toxic atmosphere of the house was finally breaking. Chloe leaned against the stone railing. She looked at the parents who had raised her. She walked over and hugged Tom with all her strength. She buried her face in his shoulder. She cried, telling him that no matter whose blood was in her veins, he would always be her real dad. Martha wrapped her arms around both of them. They stood together, A true, unbreakable family. Julian watched them, a sad smile on his face. He had lost his fake family tonight, but he had gained a real one. The heavy front doors opened one last time. Victoria and Richard struggled with their heavy bags. They didn't look back. They threw their luggage into their expensive sports car. The engine roared to life. They sped down the long driveway, the red taillights disappearing into the dark night. They were gone. The nightmare was finally over. The massive, silent mansion stood behind them. It was no longer a fortress of cruelty. It was Chloe's rightful home. The following weeks brought massive, sweeping changes. A team of ruthless lawyers descended on the sterling business empire. The evidence in the diary and financial records was overwhelming. The authorities seized the bank accounts. The gas station chain was liquidated to pay back the stolen Vance estate. Victoria and Richard faced multiple federal charges for grand larceny, fraud, and tax evasion. They ended up living in a tiny rundown apartment on the edge of the city, awaiting their criminal trial. No one in high society would even answer their phone calls. They were total pariahs. Meanwhile, Chloe and Julian moved into the grand estate, but they didn't keep it as a cold museum. They opened the windows. They brought in bright, comfortable furniture. They filled the massive yard with rescued dogs from the animal shelter. The house echoed with laughter and barking. Tom and Martha sold their small farm. They moved into the spacious guest house on the property. Tom took over managing the vast financial estate. He was back in his element, securing Chloe's immense fortune. Julian used his economics degree to start a massive charitable foundation funded by the recovered money. He focused on helping underprivileged orphans and funding animal rescues. They planned a massive, beautiful wedding in the estate's blooming gardens. They invited all their real friends, the shelter volunteers, and the kind neighbours. There were no fake socialites allowed. Before the grand wedding, Chloe had one final, deeply emotional task to complete. On a quiet, overcast Tuesday morning, Tom drove Chloe and Julian to a massive, peaceful cemetery on the edge of the city. Huge oak trees provided deep shade. They walked along a winding stone path until they reached a grand, polished black marble monument. It was completely surrounded by fresh, vibrant flowers. This was the final resting place of Arthur Vance and his wife. Chloe stood before the grave of the parents she never knew. Tears streamed silently down her face. She reached out and traced the engraved letters of their names. Tom stood beside her. He placed a heavy, comforting hand on her shoulder. He told her stories about her biological father. He described Arthur's booming laugh and his sharp business mind. He told her about her beautiful mother's gentle smile. Tom confessed a secret. Every year, on the 9th of April, he would leave the farm and disappear for the entire day. He told Chloe he was visiting an old friend. The truth was, he came to this very cemetery. He would sit by the grave for hours. He would talk to Arthur. He would tell him about Chloe's first steps, her incredible grades in school, and her massive heart. He kept his promise to his best friend. He protected her. Chloe wept openly. She felt a profound sense of closure. She finally knew exactly who she was. A month later, the wedding was a spectacular, joyous event. The garden was decorated with thousands of white roses and sparkling fairy lights. Chloe looked like an absolute angel in a flowing, simple lace gown. Julian looked incredibly handsome in a classic tuxedo. Tom walked her down the grassy aisle. He was beaming with absolute pride. The rescued dogs ran happily around the edges of the ceremony. Wearing little silk bow ties, they danced late into the warm summer night. For their honeymoon, they flew to a private villa in Hawaii. Chloe had dreamed of seeing the ocean since she was a little girl reading magazines on the farm. The tropical island was absolute paradise. The crystal clear blue water gently crashed against the white sand. Tall palm trees swayed in the warm, salty breeze. They spent their days snorkeling over colourful coral reefs and their evenings eating fresh fruit on their private balcony. It was a time of perfect, uninterrupted peace. They had survived the toxicity of the Sterling family. They had uncovered a massive, life-changing secret. They had built a beautiful new reality based on truth and love. The dark clouds of their past had completely vanished. The future stretched out before them, bright and full of incredible promise. but life always has one more beautiful surprise waiting just around the corner. On the 5th morning of their honeymoon, the bright island sun poured through the sheer white curtains of their bedroom. Julian woke up to the sound of crashing waves. He reached out across the large soft bed, but the space beside him was completely empty. He heard a sudden violent sound coming from the massive marble bathroom. He threw off the lightweight sheets and rushed in. Chloe was kneeling on the cool floor, gripping the edge of the toilet. She was incredibly pale and trembling violently. A terrible wave of sickness had overtaken her. Julian panicked. He immediately assumed she had gotten severe food poisoning from the exotic seafood they ate the night before. He grabbed a cool, damp towel and gently wiped her forehead. He scooped her up in his strong arms. He ignored her weak protests. He carried her down to the villa's private golf cart and rushed her to the local island clinic. He paced back and forth in the small, sterile waiting room for what felt like hours. He was terrified. He had finally found his perfect happiness, and he was terrified of losing her. He prayed silently. Finally, the heavy wooden door opened. The smiling, grey-haired island doctor stepped out. He looked at Julian's frantic face and chuckled softly. He told Julian to sit down and take a deep breath. The doctor extended a warm, weathered hand. He shook Julian's hand vigorously. He smiled brightly and said congratulations. He told the terrified young man that he was going to be a father. He explained that Chloe was not suffering from food poisoning. She was experiencing completely normal, healthy morning sickness. She was almost 4 months pregnant. The doctor advised them to stay out of the direct, harsh afternoon sun and to make sure she drank plenty of water. Julian stood frozen in absolute shock. The words echoed in his brain. A father. He was going to be a father. The door opened wider and Chloe stepped out. She looked incredibly tired, but her eyes were shining with tears of pure joy. Julian let out a loud, joyous shout. He completely ignored the clinic staff. He ran forward and wrapped his arms around her. He lifted her off the floor and spun her around in a tight circle. He kissed her face a dozen times. He yelled out that they were having a baby. He promised her he would be the greatest father in the world. He promised he would break the cycle of cold, distant parenting he had experienced. He told her she needed to rest. He joked that she had been keeping a massive secret from him. He couldn't believe she hadn't noticed the signs. Chloe laughed softly, burying her face in his warm neck. She admitted that with the insane stress of the dinner, the massive revelations, the police investigations, and the wedding planning, she hadn't been paying attention to her own body. She thought her exhaustion was just from the endless adrenaline of the past few months. She looked up at him, her beautiful eyes wide with a sudden trace of vulnerability. She whispered that she was suddenly terrified. She asked if they were truly ready to be parents. They were both still so young. They had just started their new lives. Julian held her face gently between his hands. He looked deeply into her eyes. He told her they were more than ready. He reminded her of the endless love and patience she showed the broken animals at the shelter. He told her that with Tom and Martha living right on the estate, they had an incredible support system. He promised her that they would face this beautiful new challenge together as a team. They walked out of the clinic hand in hand. The bright Hawaiian sun felt incredibly warm on their skin. The sound of the ocean seemed like a joyous celebration. They spent the rest of the day lying under a massive umbrella on the beach. They drank fresh coconut water and talked endlessly about nursery colours and baby names. When they finally returned to their massive estate in New England, they shared the incredible news with Tom and Martha. The reaction was absolutely explosive. Martha burst into happy tears and immediately started talking about knitting tiny baby blankets. Tom let out a booming laugh that shook the walls. He hugged Julian so hard he nearly cracked the young man's ribs. That very evening, they sat around the grand dining table. It was the exact same table where Victoria had once tried to destroy Chloe. Now it was covered in blueprints for a new nursery and catalogues for baby cribs. Tom looked around the room, his eyes shining with deep emotion. He raised a glass of sparkling cider. He toasted to the future. He looked at the ceiling and whispered a quiet thank you to his old friend Arthur. He knew Arthur would be incredibly proud of the strong, beautiful woman his daughter had become. The dark, venomous legacy of the Sterling family was completely erased from the walls of this house. It was replaced by the bright, ringing laughter of a family bound by love, not greed. The dogs slept peacefully by the roaring fireplace. The house felt warm and truly alive. Chloe rested her hand gently on her stomach. She leaned against her incredible husband. She knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they were surrounded by an unbreakable wall of love. Far away, on the bleak outskirts of the city, Victoria Sterling mopped the greasy floor of a cheap, late-night diner. The harsh fluorescent lights highlighted the deep wrinkles and bitter lines on her face. Her hands were raw from the cheap cleaning chemicals. She muttered angry, venomous curses under her breath. She blamed everyone else for her massive downfall. She refused to accept that her own cruelty and greed had sealed her terrible fate. Richard had completely abandoned her, wandering the streets in a drunken haze. She had absolutely nothing left. No money, no power, and no family. She had tried to humiliate a poor, innocent girl, and in doing so, she had accidentally handed over the keys to her stolen empire. It was the ultimate poetic justice. True wealth is not found in stolen bank accounts or diamond necklaces. It is found in the purity of a kind heart and the unshakable loyalty of real family. Chloe had won the ultimate victory without ever being cruel. She had simply remained true to herself. The dark shadows of the past had finally been completely banished. The sun was shining brightly on the Vance estate once again. A new generation was about to be born into a world of incredible love, second chances, and undeniable truth. And that is a legacy no amount of money could ever buy. The truth always finds a way to the light. Victoria thought her stolen wealth and cruel words made her untouchable, but her arrogance became her ultimate downfall. Chloe and Julian proved that pure hearts and real love will always triumph over toxic greed and manipulation. What was your favourite moment in this story? Was it the shocking twist about Chloe's true identity, or seeing the wicked stepmother get exactly what she deserved? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this cinematic story of justice and family secrets, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling tale. See you in the next video.